Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a really fascinating topic this time. Based on the materials you sent over, it's all about neurogenetics, basically how our genes build and run our brains.
It's fundamental stuff, really. Looking at the very instructions, that make our brains work.
Exactly. And our goal here is to pull out the core ideas from your sources on this really deep connection between our DNA and, well, our minds.
Yeah, it's about trying to unravel how what we inherit shapes everything from basic brain wiring right up to our thoughts and feelings.
Right. Like, have you ever wondered why some people just seem, I don't know, naturally better at focusing? Or maybe why things like anxiety seem to run in families?
Or even why you might be great at one thing and someone else excels somewhere totally different.
Yeah. And the sources suggest the answers, or at least big clues, are tangled up in this gene-brain interplay. Okay, so just to start us off, what is neurogenetics in simple terms?
Okay, well, think of neurogenetics as the field that studies how genes, the bits of inheritance we get from our parents, influence how our brains are built and how they function.
Okay.
One source had a good analogy. The brain is like a supercomputer, right? And our genes, they're like the coded instructions. They dictate how it's put together, how it's wired, and even how it operates day to day, processing information.
So it's not just like a blueprint set at birth and that's it. Because our brains change, we learn things.
That's a really crucial point. Genes absolutely set the stage early on, directing how neurons grow, where they go, how those initial connections, the synapses form, the little gaps where brain cells chat.
Right, the communication point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But their job doesn't stop there. Genes also influence how our brains react later on to experiences, to learning, stress, emotions.
So like how easily I might learn a new language compared to someone else, that could have a genetic component.
It could, yeah. Small variations in genes can tweak how our brains respond. Even something like memory capacity can be, significantly shaped by these inherited differences.
Wow. Okay, let's dig into that early stage a bit more. You mentioned genes setting the stage. Are there specific ones known to be really important for, like, building the brain?
Definitely. During prenatal development, it's this incredibly complex process, and certain genes are like project managers.
Okay.
The sources highlighted a few key ones. Names like FOXP2, MECP2, and SHANK3 came up.
I remember those, yeah.
These essentially guide the creation of brain cells and the formation of those synapses, laying down the basic circuitry we need for everything else.
And one of the sources mentioned that if something goes wrong with those specific genes, it can cause major problems.
Absolutely. If there are mutations, changes in these critical genes, it can lead to what we call neurodevelopmental conditions.
Such as?
Well, for example, mutations in MECP2 are strongly linked to Rett syndrome, which mostly affects brain development in girls. And variations in SHANK3, they're often associated with autism spectrum disorders.
Right.
And what's really important here, and the sources stress this, is that these conditions have clear genetic roots. They aren't the result of, say, bad parenting or too much screen time, things you sometimes hear debated.
That's such an important distinction to make. It's biological?
It originates in the blueprint, in the wiring process itself.
Okay, that really clarifies the development side. But then the sources also talked about genes influencing things like memory, intelligence, even personality. That feels much more interesting.
It does, doesn't it? And it's a super active area of research. One molecule that popped up a lot in the materials was BDNF.
BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
That's the one. Think of it like fertilizer for your brain cells.
Okay, I like that.
It helps neurons grow, survive, and make new connections, which is obviously crucial for learning and memory.
So if you have genes that lead to more BDNF, you just have a better memory.
Well, it's linked. Higher BDNF levels often correlate with better memory, maybe faster learning, potentially even some protection against things like depression.
But it's not purely genetic, is it? Can you influence BDNF levels?
Oh, absolutely. That's the nuance. Your genes might give you a certain baseline level, maybe a predisposition, but things like exercise, learning new skills, staying mentally active, those can all boost BDNF production too.
Ah, so nature and nurture again.
Exactly. It's always an interaction. Another gene mentioned was COMT. COMT.
Right. I remember reading about that one. It has something to do with dopamine.
Yeah, it does. It influences an enzyme that breaks down dopamine, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, the brain's sort of executive control center.
Okay, involved in focus, decision-making, that kind of thing.
Precisely. And there are different versions, different alleles of the COMT gene.
And these different versions work differently.
Kind of. One version might lead to dopamine hanging around a bit longer, which could be linked to, say, better focus under pressure, maybe more stability. Another version might break down dopamine more quickly, which some studies tentatively link to maybe slightly different tendencies, perhaps more flexibility, but maybe also more vulnerability to anxiety or impulsivity in certain situations.
And I feel like this is a big but coming.
It is a huge but. This is crucial, and your sources were clear on it. Genes are not destiny. They give you predispositions, tendencies maybe. But your environment, your experiences, education, stresses, coping mechanisms, all of that interacts with your genes in incredibly complex ways to shape who you actually are.
So it's never just one gene determining you'll be anxious or you'll be focused.
Definitely not. It's way more complicated, a whole network of genes interacting with a lifetime of experiences.
That makes a lot more sense. It avoids that kind of genetic determinism. Okay, so building on that,
Yeah.
one area where the genetic link seems pretty strong, according to the sources, is mental health.
Yes, there's significant evidence for genetic factors in many mental health conditions. You often see patterns in families for things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, ADHD.
Suggesting an inherited vulnerability.
Exactly, a vulnerability or a predisposition.
Mhm.
The sources mentioned a gene called DIC1 disrupted in schizophrenia 1.
Okay.
It's involved in how neurons grow and communicate. Certain variations in DIC1 are considered risk genes for schizophrenia. They don't cause it directly, but they increase the statistical likelihood.
So if someone has one of these risk genes, say for schizophrenia, does that mean they will get it?
No, not necessarily at all. This is where that loaded dice analogy from one of the sources comes in handy.
Right, I remember that.
Having a risk gene is like having dice that are slightly weighted towards rolling a certain number. It doesn't guarantee that number to come up every time or even at all.
Okay, so what are the other factors that roll the dice?
Environmental factors are key. Things like stress, especially early life stress or trauma, major life events, even substance use. These can act as triggers. It's often this combination, the underlying genetic vulnerability plus certain environmental pressures, that leads to a condition developing.
That's a much more hopeful way of looking at it, actually. It's not predetermined.
Not at all. And it highlights areas where maybe interventions could help, focusing on managing those environmental triggers.
Which connects nicely to what the sources said about personalized medicine in this field.
Yes, exactly. That's a really exciting prospect. The more we understand these specific genetic variations linked to brain conditions, the closer we get to tailoring treatments.
How so?
Imagine therapies designed to target the specific genetic pathway that's maybe not working optimally in that particular person. It could mean more effective treatments, perhaps with fewer side effects than the sort of one-size-fits-all approaches we often rely on now.
That really could be revolutionary for treating brain disorders. Okay, there was one last thing the sources touched on, which sounds almost sci-fi. Editing genes in the brain. Is that actually possible?
It's moving from science fiction towards reality, yes. It's very cutting edge. Technologies like CRISPR.
Right, the gene editing tool.
Exactly. It allows scientists to make precise changes to DNA. And researchers are definitely exploring using these tools to try and correct faulty genes that cause certain neurological disorders.
Have they had any success?
There's been some promising work in animal models. Your sources mentioned studies in mice where gene therapy seemed to reverse symptoms related to conditions like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's.
Wow, in mice. But what about humans?
Human trials are actually starting or are in very early stages for some conditions.
Wally.
Yes. But it's crucial to stress this is still highly experimental. There are significant risks, ethical questions. It's not a simple fix. But it does offer a potential path, maybe someday, to fixing the root genetic cause of some devastating brain diseases.
That leads directly into the ethical side, doesn't it? If we can edit brain-related genes, should we?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? There's a huge ethical debate. Where do you draw the line between therapy, correcting a gene that causes a severe disease, and enhancement?
Right, like editing genes related to intelligence or emotional traits.
Precisely. What would that mean for society? For equality? For what it even means to be human? These aren't just scientific questions. They're deep philosophical and societal ones that, maybe our kids or grandkids will really have to grapple with.
It's mind-boggling stuff. This whole field just opens up so many fundamental questions.
It really does. It forces us to think about how much of who we are, our thoughts, feelings, abilities, is tied to the biology of our brains and the genes that built them.
Like the sources said, we're shaped by our molecules as much as our experiences.
Yeah, it's that constant interplay. Our genes set up potentials, our environment shapes how those potentials play out, and that experience can even feed back to influence how our genes are expressed. It's a dynamic loop.
So wrapping this up, a key takeaway seems to be that neurogenetics shows just how deeply biological the roots of our minds really are.
I think that's right. It gives us a glimpse into the code that makes each of us unique, but also connects us through shared biology.
Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. If our identity is so intertwined with our genes and brains, what does that mean for our understanding of ourselves and maybe even our future potential?
A profound question indeed. Lots to think about there.
Absolutely. Well, this has been incredibly insightful. Thanks for diving into this complex topic with me.
My pleasure. It's fascinating stuff.
And thank you for joining us. We hope this look into neurogenetics has given you some new perspectives. Until the next deep dive, keep asking questions and stay curious.